Okay, everybody, you guys are in the next room working on your workshops, and I'm going to do this lecture so that we can actually do this before class and we could get into the auth workshop, which is what we're going to be busy with for a few different sessions. So let's talk about the data flow of authorization. Um, so what we're going to be talking about is actually how someone goes in and logs into the application. We're going to talk a little bit more about how to deal with web security in the workshop after this. But for now, let's take the example of someone goes and signs up for your application. So they would end up going in and creating a password. They would end up, that password would end up getting stored in the database. And the next time that they wanted to go and use your application and they wanted to authenticate themselves, and in other words, we wanted to find out if they were who they said they were, we would give them the option to give us a username and password, and we would go in and check that password matched the password in the database. All right. And again, we're not talking, this is sort of very simplistic, logging into the application. In fact, we're even showing this going over HTTP, so not even really that secure a protocol. But the key here is that, sure, we can verify who they are, but then what happens after that? How do we keep them logged in? And why would we want to end up keeping them logged in? Well, we want them to interact with the application as a particular user, meaning that everything that we've built up to this point hasn't had any sort of, we haven't been at all concerned of who the current user of the application was. If you created a playlist, you ended up creating it for the application. There was no user that was involved there. What we would like to do is, for instance, if we were building that jukebox, maybe someone would end up logging in, and we would end up storing their playlist with their user ID. And so if they were ended up logging in, we could then go and make a request to get their particular playlist. If they wanted to add something to the playlist, we could end up making a request. We would have some identification of who the user is. And the question is, how do we end up doing that? Because really what we end up having with HTTP is that things are stateless, meaning that, sure, the user could log in and we could say, oh boy, this, someone ended up submitting a login form here. Oh, they are who they say we are, but the question is, what do we end up doing with it after that? How do we make sure that as they interact with the application, as they end up making requests, we are able to identify them as that user? So we could think of a couple of different ways that maybe we could go about accomplishing this. I mean, maybe they end up making a request to log in, they make an AJAX request, maybe we send back some script variables that go and identify them as the user. Or maybe we end up going in and storing their username and password, so that every time they make a request, we end up checking and seeing, hey, look, we're basically re-authenticating them on every request. So this doesn't work for a couple of different reasons. If we ended up doing it basically just with a script variable, then it's going to be lost pretty quick every time that the user would end up reloading their application. That script would end up getting lost, right? I mean, the script is only stored in memory in the browser, and that would be lost, so that wouldn't be all that helpful. We could think about doing this with database documents, but this is going to be a little bit problematic because then we're sending this sensitive information with every single request, and that might be something that we want to avoid too. There's security issues with doing that, and it's going to be a little. We don't want to sort of keep that information around all the time for people to look at. We sort of want to minimize that that sort of private information with their username and password going over the wire. So how could we end up doing this? Well, the answer is cookies, of course, right? And when we think about cookies, really what it ends up coming down to is a cookie is really nothing more than a small text file that's stored on the browser, and that a particular domain has access to the cookies that were set with their domain. So if we look at how this workflow is going to work, the client could end up making a request to the server. This is sort of the normal workflow. Client makes a request, and the client ends up getting a response. Okay? But we could imagine that with cookies, what we could do is we could end up making a request. We could then go and check, hey, look, has this cookie, is there a cookie in the request? Meaning, did we set up a cookie yet for this user? And if we haven't set up a cookie for this user, well, now we set it, we put it in the response, and it comes back. And at this point, now the user has a cookie to make requests with and to get responses with. And the bottom line is really what do we end up doing with the cookie? And the cookie is just going to have enough information in it. We're not going to store, private information there, but it's going to have just enough information for us to basically identify the user and to access resources. When we say resources, let's say a particular user's playlist based upon that cookie. So what ends up happening is that, I'm not sure why this part was in there, but basically for every request after that, we're going to have this cookie, and the server is going to use this cookie to uniquely identify a session, which is really going to uniquely identify a user. So when we end up thinking about this sort of simplistically, and we've got a sort of nice slide deck here that we're going to use that'll show you how this works. So the server, after figuring out that the user is who they say they are, we end up giving the client a cookie with an ID only. And the client keeps the cookie, but the client ends up sending it with all the requests. So every request that ends up getting made, the client ends up sending the cookie. And when that request comes back, the server can load specific information, like who the user is, and they can end up storing this information on the server. So basically, there's going to be we could imagine there's some sort of hash that sort of maps this ID of the cookie with a particular user. Now, we're not going to have to reinvent everything here. There are modules that we're going to be able to use that will end up doing this for us, but that's sort of what's happening behind the scenes. If we were to sort of give a little bit of a demonstration of this. So on the left, we're looking at our backend. Okay, and we have this Express application that's got a bunch of pieces of middleware in it. There is a session store that we have on the server. Let's just say that this is just an in-memory store of users that are logged into the application. On the client side, you see that there's cookies that maybe have been set by GitHub. There's cookies that have been set by some other site. And we've got our application, which hasn't set any cookies yet. So let's say that we end up making a GET request. The client makes a GET request to our server. And what will end up happening here, there's no cookie that's inside of the cookie store. The request ends up getting made without the cookie. Okay? So it goes to the server gets it, and says, hey, look, there's no cookie that has been sent yet. Let me rephrase it. So there's no cookie yet. At this point, it ends up going to the server. The server ends up looking at the request, and it ends up hitting this session middleware, right? And it's looking at the request. It sees that there's no cookie in the request. And what ends up happening is that the server will say, hey, look, the user didn't come here with a cookie. Let's create a session, and let's do it by creating a cookie. So what will happen is that, again, this is all happening on the server. It's happening with middleware. That's going to be your session middleware. And you can imagine that in the session store, there's going to be some unique ID that's put in here that's going to go identify the user. So if a client ends up coming with this particular key, they'll be able to get this information. Now, we haven't sent it back to the client yet, but what will happen is that the session middleware will set a property on the request and say, hey, look, the request.session is equal to this empty object. So you have access to this request.session. The response ends up getting sent to the user. And in the response, in order for this to end up going back and forth, this ID has been created on the server. This ID is going to end up getting sent back to the client. So when the response ends up coming back to the client, they'll see, the browser will see, hey, look, here's the response. There's a cookie that needs to be set, in which case that cookie will be sent to the cookie store. And then the next request that ends up getting made, that cookie will be passed in here. So this is a way that if you were authenticating a user through your application, this is how you would end up setting it up, right? The user is going to provide some way, some password, username and password combination. Again, assuming that it's correct, we're going to set a cookie, and this cookie is going to go back and forth. Now, there are some issues with this. If those cookies are not secure on the client, if someone gets access to those cookies, there are ways that they could take those cookies and basically spoof a user. But this is, there are ways to sort of mitigate against that. Again, we're not talking about security here. We're just talking about how you can have this one process where the user ends up authenticating, and after that time, there basically is this cookie that goes back and forth and identifies who the user is, and we could store information about that user in the session store. I mean, for instance, as a sort of a simple scenario, maybe in that session store, if the user has logged in, maybe we would map, the user ID to that key value. And so at that point, every time a request goes in, we have a way of identifying the user. That's what we're talking about when we end up talking about authentication. We could find out who the user is. So the next thing that we're going to look at is we're going to talk about other ways that we can end up logging into an application through a third party, and we're going to talk about OAuth. Okay, so maybe the user doesn't want to log in through your application, or maybe you just want to make it easier for a user to go in and try to figure out what their, what username they should be using and what password they should be using, right? It's, at some point there's a fatigue that sort of sets in with, choosing a password and remembering your passwords. And even though there are some password manager tools that are out there, I started to use one recently. It still would be nice if someone could, log into your application without thinking about it. Well, that's where some of these, we could have a third party, we could log in through a third party. So what we're going to be talking about here is just identifying the user through a third party. And let's talk about these three terms here. We've got the application that we're writing that we want users to be able to log into. So we've got our application. This is going to be the consumer. We've got the user who's going to be the end user. This is whoever is sitting in front of the browser interacting with our application. And we've got a third-party authority that, let's say that a lot of users have accounts with already. So, when we think about third-party authority, let's think about Google. Let's think about, for developers, GitHub, Facebook, right? These are all third parties that, users, are not going to, it's going to be odd because if users are using these third parties, it's not likely that they're going to end up forgetting their password. That password they're going to remember. And what we're going to do is we're going to identify the user through the third party. And let's try to, you've probably done this a ton of times already in terms of you've probably acted as the user where you've logged into other applications, but it's kind of a little bit of a complicated process in terms of how this works. And I think these slides are excellent in terms of helping simplify how it works. So let's take a moment and talk about all these different pieces here. So the consumer app is going to be registered with the provider, meaning that your consumer application that you create, you're going to actually go over to either Facebook or to GitHub and say, hey, look, this application that I created, we would like to use you as a third-party provider. And what they're going to end up doing is they're going to provide us with two pieces of information. They're going to provide us with a secret that both of us share and also an ID. And we can think of the ID as not being all that secret, but that secret, we want to make sure that it doesn't end up getting exposed. This is also something to sort of think about where, if you're committing things, we'll say it really right off the bat, where you're committing things to GitHub, if in fact you do register with a third-party provider, things like the secret that you have, you should make sure they don't end up making it into GitHub, even if you don't allow everybody to see your GitHub. Just in case GitHub ended up getting hacked, you really don't want this secret to get out. So this provider gives us a public client ID and this private client secret, the ID and the S that are up here. And both services hold on to these credentials so that I could always go back and I could say to the provider, hey, look, it's me. How do you know it's me? Because here's the secret that only the two of us know. So what ends up happening when a user would end up going to our site, and there's going to be a number of steps here, but let's just sort of break it down in terms of what the user is going to end up seeing. User goes to our site and they go to login. And we give them a login page. And we say, all right, you could log in. You could log in through us with your username and password. But we're also going to give them another option where they're going to be able to say, hey, look, you know what, I want to log in through Facebook, or I want to log in through GitHub, or I want to log in through Google, any third-party provider that we as a consumer have these accounts set up with. And they're fairly easy to set up. So what will end up happening at this point, once they end up doing this, it's going to be our responsibility to send a response. And we're going to send a response. We have this sort of public key that we send back. And what we're going to do is we're going to send a response back that's going to tell the browser to redirect. And we're going to say, look, go over to the provider. There's a specific URL that the provider has provided to us. There's some work on their end. They've agreed to be a third-party provider, and we give them our client ID. And we also give them a callback. And we give them a callback to say, hey, look, when this process is done, come on back to our site, and here's the URL that you could end up coming back to. Again, we have to do this because this is being done through these HTTP requests. So at this point, we have a redirect, and what will happen is that now we have this ID, there's a redirect, the user, and again, using my words carefully, the end user is going to make a request to the provider for to say, hey, look, I want to log in through this consumer. I want you to tell this consumer who I am. And so what will end up happening is that we'll get a login that's rendered, this is sort of a public key. So one of the things that they could have here is we could say they'll sort of know who we are based on this public key. One other thing that I sort of mentioned here, there's also this idea of scope. So the other thing is that the user is agreeing and saying, hey, look, I want, in terms of giving permission to the consumer to access things on the provider, they might specify what things they could end up accessing. Now, we're not really talking about the access level yet, because right now we're just worried about being able to authenticate the user. But again, there are permissions where, let's say that not only am I going to not only am I going to use a third-party provider to log you in, but I also might want to act on behalf of you to the third-party provider. Maybe you've given me permission to GitHub to end up managing your repositories, or maybe for Google to get access to your contact list, and that's really where that scope ends up coming in. So at this point, we've got this login that ends up getting rendered, and the user will now, assuming they weren't logged in before, the user is going to end up logging in to the provider. And assuming that their login is correct, what will happen is that there's going to be some authorization code where this C is coming in that's going to end up being sent back. And what will happen is that the same way that we ended up redirecting to the provider is going to send a response back, and it's going to tell them to redirect to us. So don't forget, in the earlier slide, we said, here, look, this is the URL that we should end up redirecting to, and we've got this code that's here. Okay? Now, all of this is fairly useless at this point, but when they end up making the request to us with this authorization code, and it ends up going back to our server, right? They're going to end up doing a redirect. The provider is going to do a redirect that's going to go back to us with this authorization code. Now, what we have is we have this authorization code, but don't forget we also have this secret and we also have this ID. And what we end up doing is we end up exchanging this information. We basically specify, look, here's this information, this code that you sent us, and the reason why you know it's us, because I'm providing you with this secret that only the two of us know. So it's really the combination of this public ID of the application, this secret of the application, and this client code where an access token ends up coming back. And this access token is going to basically say, hey, look, all right, now we know who you are. For instance, one thing that we could get with this access token is maybe your username at this provider, and some other information about you at this provider. And at that point, we have authenticated you without you ever giving us your password directly. So there's, again, a bunch of steps that we're looking at in order to do it. And now let's sort of break down who has the different responsibilities for all these things that are happening. Okay, so I know that this is a ton of text that's on this slide, but let's actually look at this again to understand all these pieces. Right, so if we end up looking at step one, this is the user basically saying, I want to log in to the consumer's application. If we look at the response, this is a page that comes back. That's going to be, hey, look, input your username and password here, or you can log into one of our third-party providers. Okay? In step three, the user says, sure, I would like to use one of your third-party providers that you have configured. And what will end up happening is that we're going to click on this link, and the request is going to come back to the consumer. And the response that we're going to end up sending back is going to be a response that's going to have a redirect in it. So we're going to go back to the user, but we're just going to go back to the user with a redirect. The user's not going to see anything from us at that point. They're just going to end up seeing a redirect to us. And so step five, the reason why we say implicit is that this is nothing that the user is doing to initiate this, right? What they've done is that in step three, they've said, I want to log into this third-party provider. We've sent them back a response, but that response has automatically been redirected to the provider. It's implicitly been done. There's nothing that they've had to do. They've already done that in step three. So the provider is responsible for rendering some type of login page. In step 7, the user ends up basically giving their information, their username and password, and says, yep, I want to allow the consumer to find out some information about me. And the provider is responsible for, again, sending a response that's going to do a redirect, right? So we see in step 9, when we say implicit, they're not actually coming back to our application on their own. They're coming back to our application through a redirect. So in steps 10 and 11, I take this code that I get back. I prove to the provider I am who I am by basically giving them the secret code that only we know about. And they provide me with some information so that I can determine who the user is. And again, I could access some information about the user, again, maybe their username or something along those lines. If I wanted to, I could use that information and create an account on my system that I could end up using for the user. So, and I guess one thing that's also important is that the information that I end up getting back from them for that user should be really the same information every time. So if they ended up going through this process again, and I end up exchanging this code, what I get back is going to be able to identify the user the same way. And so at this point, I'm still, again, all this sort of handshaking is happening between consumer and provider. And at that point, I've identified who they are. Like I said, behind the scenes, maybe I've with this token that I'm getting, maybe I've gone and created a user on their behalf if the user didn't exist, so I have some way of tracking them in my system. Again, as long as they decide to come in through this third-party provider, I'll get this same token going back and forth to be able to identify the user in my system. So that's sort of all the different steps that we have there, but let's talk about, we really only care about what our role is in this, right? We're interested in what the consumer's role is. So again, I've got to provide a number of different things, right? I've got to provide a login page to the user, right? First of all, I've got to have a link for them to say I want to log in. I've got to provide a login page. I've got to have a link for them to click on this provider. I've got to provide a response that's going to, do this implicit redirect to the provider. I also have to handle this callback. So when the provider ends up sending back the redirect, I've got to be able to handle that. And I've also got to do this handshaking with the provider to basically exchange this code that I have for some token that's going to identify the user. And then I've got to provide something to the user. Hey, look, great, you're logged in. We believe you, right? The third party has basically vouched for you. The thing that a lot of these steps would be pretty tricky to do on their own, and it's nice that you don't have to do them. You don't have to re-roll this. So there's a module that we're going to use called Passport. And so with Passport, a lot of this other work that was up here, we no longer have to contend with. So the only things that we're going to have to do is we're going to have a link to go to the login page. We're going to have a login page. We're going to have a link that says you want to log in based on a specific provider. We're going to have to provide some endpoints so that when there is a callback that comes back to us, we end up catching that callback. But all those other steps are going to be done in terms of doing all that handshaking with the provider. These are all going to be done by Passport, and a lot of this code is pretty complex, so it's good that we don't have to do it. And the other thing that we're going to have to do is to handle some response that says, hey, look, that's great, you're logged into the application. So you could imagine there's a couple of different things that we're going to have to do, a couple of different routes that we're going to be responsible for. And so with this information, you're going to be able to dive in to the application and add authentication. Little pun here, author, right? It's this whole application is about users writing articles. So author, but also it's dealing with authentication. And that's really about it. So let's get started with the workshop.